Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Anthony Nigara, the Vice President for Business Development, Sales, and Strategy at L3Harris Technologies. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here, Anastasia.
We'll be talking about next generation command and control and how that work that's being done right now connects to the broader JADC2 or Joint All-Domain Command and Control effort across the Defense Department. Now NGC2 is probably the Army's #1 modernization priority. There's already a prototype of the system that was tested earlier this year, and now the Army is working to scale that prototype. So let's kind of start there. Could you talk about what exactly next generation command and control is? How does the Army currently do command and control, and why NGC2 would be an improvement?
Sure, that's a great question to start off with. So what is next generation command and control? If you think about how the Army does command and control today, many of the systems are siloed. What that means is you have bespoke one-off solutions that are tied to specific hardware capabilities for command and control, whether that's for fires, for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, whatever types of missions today. And that's largely because those systems were procured over various time frames and did not really get integrated in any fashion. So NGC2 is all about revamping that, and it's about putting data at the center. It's about making data available throughout the network so that decisions can be made at the speed of relevance. And one key facet of next generation command and control, though, is how you move that data around. And that's really where L3Harris comes in. We provide the resilient communications that's really the backbone or the transport layer that's fundamentally required for next generation command and control. So it's really putting the data in the spotlight and allowing that connectivity to happen across all echelons in the Army to make faster data-driven decisions.
I talked to 4th Infantry Division, and they're going to be testing out the prototype next year, and that's exactly what they were talking about. How do you move the data around? So could you first maybe give an example of how NGC2 would change the way a commander makes decisions? What does success look like, and what are the most challenging aspects that the Army is facing right now as it continues to modernize?
Sure. So how this will help enable make decisions, again, is putting the right data in the hands of the commander at the time that they need it. If you think about all of the gear and the equipment, L3Harris has fielded, for example, over 70,000 radios for the Army and our allies, but we are just one supplier of that equipment. The way that that works today is, again, those are bespoke, standalone equipment that needs to come together. Right now, that data can be bespoke. It can also be difficult to move into one place. So if you can imagine, again, data moving freely and securely in a resilient way on the battlefield, getting it to the commander at the time in which they need it to make those decisions. Today, that's very difficult to do in the environment that we see ourselves in, and Next Gen Command and Control is really going to revamp the way that's done. Now, I think if you look at how the Army is going through demonstrating, prototyping that equipment, I think they're taking the right path, and that's to try out capabilities, again, in a real relevant environment before they go ahead and procure the entire capability. I think it's a great method, because what's going to end up happening is what the Army fields always will be bespoke equipment that is from multiple suppliers. So it has to interoperate, it has to work together, and L3Harris is proud to be a key part of that, providing resilient communications for the warfighter. And we can talk a lot more about resilience, because I think it is really a bedrock for making next generation command and control successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have a lot of these tryouts over the next year. What advice would you have for them as they're going through this process?
Sure. I think the #1 advice I would give to the Army, and in fact we have given to the Army, is to make sure that you test in a relevant environment, right? So when we talk about peer conflict, when we talk about conflict like things that are happening between Ukraine and Russia today, it is a highly contested environment. It is one that is full of electronic warfare capabilities, signals intelligence capabilities that the enemy is utilizing. So if the Army can test this next generation command and control solution within a contested environment, or with relevant electronic warfare in the environment, it's going to show them that they are putting forward a system that can hold against a peer threat. So that's what we're ready to do. Our systems are very capable of performing in those contested environments. In an electronic warfare environment, we provide some of the most resilient communications on the planet. We're very proud to do that. And we really want to make sure that the Army takes full advantage of that, and additionally takes advantage of it in terms of the equipment that they already have fielded. They're going through the process of upgrading. A lot of the equipment that they have in the field today is fully software programmable. So we are adding each and every day new modes, what we call waveforms, to our resilient communication systems to make them better, to stay ahead of the threat, to stay ahead of the enemy. And again, we hope that the Army continues to test in that relevant, contested environment.
And what would you say success would look like for them next year during Project Conversion 6?
Sure, I think success looks like data free-flowing across the battlefield, right? And I know it's a demonstration event, but it is a relevant battlefield within a contested environment. So bring the best electronic warfare equipment to the fight as well, to show that the network holds, to show that the transport layer stays intact, to show that next generation command and control operates within that fully contested environment. Because what we don't want to do is have a demonstration or a test event that goes out there and shows success without proving it in a true environment that we'd see if we're going up against a real enemy. So I think that's what success looks like. And if that data is freely flowing while creating a resilient network underpinning, I think that would be a successful event.
And could you talk about the challenge of the legacy systems?
Mm-hmm.
Right now they have a kind of interim fix, but also that's a big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
It's what they're introducing, but it's happening side by side with legacy systems. Mm-hmm. How do you see that play out? How do you see them overcoming those challenges?
Sure. I think one of the challenges that the Army, or really any military faces in general, is that they field equipment at different times, right? So you're always going to have what's called a mixed fleet, or an environment of equipment that is through various vendors and ultimately different timescales of development. So I think one of the challenges the Army has is how do they move forward and deploy next generation command and control over the top of the infrastructure that they already have. And one nice thing about the equipment that L3 Harris brings, including the radios that we've already fielded through the HMS program and our leader radios, is that they are truly software defined. So with a software update, we're able to provide new resilient waveforms that allow the Army and other customers to have the most cutting edge, high data rate capabilities possible that support next generation command and control transport layer without giving up that resilience. I think one of the challenges today that we see, at least out there in the commentary, is that there's this idea you have to trade off security or resiliency for high data rate and high throughput. So one of the things about NGC2 is that to have all that data flowing through the network, you need high bandwidth communications. But the truth of the matter is you don't have to give up between those two. Today you can have resilient communications, like in the products that we provide, as well as high bandwidth and high throughput. And that's what we are going to be demonstrating as a company at Project Convergence.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that because there's a perception that there are trade-offs between that. But I also wanted to ask you about NGC2 in the context of CJADC2. Moving ahead with Joint All-Domain Command and Control, what elements do you think are the most critical for success here?
Sure. I think from a CJADC2 perspective, you think about next generation command and control, yes, it's limited to the Army, but the Army is responsible for long-range precision fires. They are a key part of the entire Department of Defense's strategy overall. So any command and control at any echelon really has to interoperate with all the other forces. So NGC2 is an integral part of CJADC2. So whether a targeting solution or something comes from another aircraft or another service, it must be able to get into NGC2 and be targeted ultimately using Army capabilities. So that's how it really fits in. And if you think about the way the Army operates today, they are effectively multi-domain because they have aircraft, they have other things in the environment. So NGC2, by its very nature, is multi-domain command and control. When we think of CJADC2, now it's just how does that plug in with the rest of the services so that you can have seamless interoperability, seamless flow of data, so that commanders and others can make the right operational decisions with the data at hand.
And earlier this year at TechNet Cyber, one of the big themes was interoperability. Specifically the challenge of disparate and siloed networks across theaters. That fragmentation is holding the department back from making progress, and of course the whole point of CJADC2 is achieving interoperability. So how do you think DoD and industry can overcome those barriers and ensure that this is actually a truly joint effort?
Sure. Look, true interoperability starts with communications, because ultimately, if you're not sharing data, you're not interoperating. So we have proven at L3Harris that you can field interoperable waveforms, both across service as well as with our joint allies. It just takes a little bit of planning. It takes the right network design, and ultimately fielding and procuring radios, software-defined systems that allow you to host the proper interoperable waveforms. So we've had a long legacy of doing that, both for the Army, the other services within the Department of Defense, and as well as all of our joint allies. So interoperability really starts with defining the network properly, making sure that the right interoperable and resilient waveforms are fielded throughout that entire campaign.
Of course, the next important part of this is resilience. One of the biggest challenges for JADC2 and NGC2, of course, is survivability in contested environments. We've seen real-life lessons emerging from battlefields in Ukraine, where communications and network resilience have really been tested. How are those lessons informing future decisions for tactical communication innovation?
Sure. Look, resiliency is extremely important. We're very proud at L3Harris to have many radios operating today on the front lines in Ukraine, supporting the Ukrainians. And look, resiliency comes from being adaptive, right? We're working each and every day to make sure that our waveforms, our radios, are the most up-to-date, pushing software enhancements literally directly to the front lines as needed to make sure we stay ahead of the electronic warfare threat that's out there. And I think it's important to talk about resilience because it is truly multifaceted. It's about the technology you field in the software, in the waveforms that are actually radiated from the radio. It's about the security of the data and the layers of security and the crypto that's used to protect that information. It's all about, as well, the multiple paths and options that you have. So it's not about fielding a single waveform or a single mode to operate in. It's giving the network operators, it's giving the commanders those options to move either manually or automatically through different modes as the electronic warfare threat changes or as the mission tempo changes in different environments. So I think it's important to bring that to the forefront in that when you field software-defined radios that can host multiple modes and waveforms like ours, in fact, we support tens of modes simultaneously, it gives you that flexibility. It gives you that flexibility to have resilience on the battlefield and to adapt in near real time to the adversaries. They change their methods.
And where do you think the Army's at, the DoD's at, when it comes to that ability to move in between different paths and having all those different options?
Sure, I think the US DoD as well as the Army has fielded the capabilities that they need to make that a reality. And again, if you look at the products that we have, I talked about over 70,000 radios deployed today. They are truly software defined. So with software enhancements, mode updates, those can be modified, again, in near real time and pushed out. So the main takeaway there is that if you look at the transport layer required for something like next generation command and control, it's ultimately in the Army's hands already today. We can enable that through software upgrades and allow that high data rate waveforms and high data rate transfer without sacrificing resiliency.
speaking about resiliency, that's of course at the center of the Army's modernization goals. What do you see as the critical elements of making sure that NGC2 is truly resilient?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one, it's making sure you field, again, software-defined capabilities, because whatever you put in the user's hands will need to be modified whenever it comes in contact with the enemy. That is a fact. And also making sure that, again, you have the pathway to make those upgrades, to have that constant feedback loop between users and the folks, the engineering talent that can make those upgrades, to make sure that that can all happen seamlessly, and to validate that in real environments. We talked about the testing of next generation command and control. It's absolutely critical that all of that happens in the most realistic electronic warfare, contested environment possible. If we do that, we will feel confident in what's fielded ultimately, that it will have the adaptation required in a peer fight to keep that network intact, as well as enable that higher level data transfer and ultimately decision maker for the commander.
Another piece that I wanted to touch on is going back to something that you mentioned at the very beginning, which is having that balance between security and flexibility. We talked about that there is a perception that you can have both, but could you talk about that trade-off and the perception that's out there? But also, could you give an example where the DoD has successfully achieved both the security and operational flexibility?
Sure. I think the fact that you have software-defined systems that are fielded with multiple modes of operation was ultimately going to give that flexibility in theater. You may have the most high bandwidth operating modes, and you may be able to utilize those freely. They may not be the most resilient waveforms, but you can do that outside of the front lines, if you will, in a less contested environment on the same hardware. And as you sort of penetrate into more challenging areas in the battle space, the system, either via the network or the radio itself, can either automatically detect and require mode changes, or it can be done manually via the user to provide more resilient waveforms. Yes, in that case, there's a slight trade-off in bandwidth, but the entire network will hold together, and it's important to know that you can basically seamlessly switch between the most resilient, most secure capabilities, as well as the highest data rate, all on the fly. So I think it's really important to just unlock that software functionality within whatever's being fielded.
And taking that further, could you talk about the DDIL environment and what some of those challenges are when it comes to DDIL environment and NGC2?
Sure. So the DDIL environment is very challenging, and it's not just about jamming, right? We think about communications being jammed by the adversary, in other words, taken out completely, but there's also other parallel threat vectors. One is just pure detection, right? So if you're carrying a device that's radiating and then it's radiating a waveform that can be easily detected, well, the enemy knows something is going on. And then the next level of detection is what we call geolocation. So if they are able to, at a reasonable range, not only detect, but geolocate, in other words, figure out exactly where that radiation is coming from, then you're even more susceptible. You're more susceptible to being targeted, you're more susceptible to maneuver and other things by the enemy. So it's really three layers. It's, are you being detected? Are you being located and targeted? And then ultimately, are you being jammed? So the systems that we field at L3Harris are resilient against all three of those, right? So they're called low probability of detection, low probability of geolocation, as well as anti-jam. So it's very important that those three come together. And then in a true DDIL environment, you will have all of those sort of threat vectors operating simultaneously. So we need to make sure that we test our systems in that environment, and then we field systems that are capable of, again, operating within that peer level fight.
And Anthony, before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you what you're working on, what's next for L3Harris, what's on the horizon for fiscal 2026. And yeah, could you already highlighted how you're working with the Army, but could you highlight some of those efforts?
Yeah, sure, that's great. Happy to talk about our newest capabilities. So we are constantly improving. At L3Harris, we have a commercial mindset, which means that we, and a business model that supports that. In other words, we invest ahead of need. So we stay ahead of the requirements that are out there, and we build and design products ahead of that need, and we sell them under commercial pricing to our customers. So that means is that we have to gather all the inputs from all of our users, both domestically and our allies, on what we need. So we are really excited about some of the new waveforms that we're coming out with, again, adding resiliency as well as focused on high data rate, and those will become available on not only our newest radio products that are coming out, but also be able to go back into our fielded equipment. So it's like getting that new app for your phone. It's like getting that enhancement without buying all new hardware. So we have those rolling out as we continue to support the Army and our allies. And we're most excited too about some of our international products that are going direct into the user's hands. Obviously, we see all the things going on in Ukraine and how NATO is continuing to make new procurements of equipment. So we're ramping up to field as much as we can into that environment. Of course, giving all of our partners all of the most resilient communications possible. So yeah, we're excited about our new radios, but we're just equally excited about our new software, even though you don't get to see that openly in the environment.
Right. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank today's guest, Anthony Nigara, the Vice President for Business Development, Sales, and Strategy at L3Harris Technologies. I'm Anastasia Obis, and you're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search L3Harris Technologies.